I was standing at the edge of the ballroom, nursing a soda, when the CEO herself walked straight across the room and stopped in front of me. Her smile slipped, her eyes searching mine, and then she asked, calm, direct, "Why don't you take me home?" The music and laughter went on like nothing had happened, but in that instant, everything around me blurred. The ballroom glimmered under tiers of crystal chandeliers that threw warm shards of light across polished marble, and Daniel stood near the edge of it all, trying to make himself smaller, tugging at the stubborn knot in his inexpensive tie while telling himself he was only here because his boss insisted he deserved it. Even though he still felt like the guy people waved over only when the Wi-Fi died, and the music of laughter and clinking glass made that feeling louder, not softer. He took a careful sip of soda, the bubbles stinging his throat, and tried to look occupied without pretending to belong, watching waiters drift like synchronized swimmers and hearing snatches of conversation that sounded like a foreign language, valuations, quarterly targets, a vineyard in Sonoma. Each phrase reminding him that he'd come from a quiet apartment where the wallpaper peeled at the corners and a small nightlight glowed for a 6-year-old who hated the dark. Across the room, a sudden swell of laughter rose and fell around Victoria Hayes, the center of a circle that opened and closed with each step she took, her gown catching the light as if it had been stitched from the chandeliers themselves. And Daniel felt the usual distance everyone respected around her, the myth of ice and gold and steel-spined certainty that made colleagues speak about her the way people speak about weather: powerful, unpredictable, something to endure rather than influence. Yet even from here he noticed the small betrayals of her face when she thought no one watched, the smile that slipped half an inch after a joke landed, the blink that lasted a beat too long, the way her shoulders settled a fraction lower once the cluster of admirers turned their attention elsewhere, and he wondered what it cost a person to be a symbol every hour of the day, to carry that shining armor made of expectation until it pressed sharp against the skin. Someone brushed past him, murmuring an apology without meeting his eyes, and he moved another step toward the wall, feeling the chill of stone against his back, telling himself he would stay 15 more minutes out of politeness, and then leave with whatever dignity a man could keep after standing alone at a party meant for people who spoke in numbers and names that never crossed his desk, and this quiet plan soothed him the way routine always did. He shifted his weight and let his gaze return to the room, first to the band counting through a practiced bridge, then to a waiter balancing a tray of champagne flutes, and finally, almost reluctantly, back to Victoria, who had turned slightly away from her circle as if listening for a sound only she could hear. And in that moment when her face was in profile, he saw not a headline or a legend, but a tired woman steadying herself between breaths. Their eyes met not with drama, but with the accidental precision of two people looking up at the same time. And Daniel felt something tighten and loosen at once, a small shock of being seen by the person no one expected to see anyone. His first instinct to glance over his shoulder in case someone more appropriate stood behind him, someone who wore confidence like a tuxedo instead of renting it by the hour. She held the look a heartbeat longer than politeness required, and then she began to cross the room with the strange, effortless authority of a tide that knows its shoreline, the crowd parting in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with gravity, while Daniel's mind scraped for the right posture, the right expression, the right version of himself to present when power chose to stand directly in front of him. He placed his cup on a high table and smoothed the front of his jacket as if unwrinkling the fabric could refine the man inside it, reminded himself to breathe through his nose the way he told his daughter to do when she got nervous before show and tell, and tried not to think about all the stories he'd heard of leaders who could change a life with a sentence, good or bad, because he knew ordinary people could do that too, only not with investors watching. By the time Victoria stopped in front of him, the band had landed softly on a new song. The chandeliers had settled into a calm whitening of the room, and Daniel felt a strange steadiness come over him, the kind that sometimes arrived in the split second before a complicated repair, hands ready, breath measured, mind clear, because whatever happened next would be precise and real and happening to him, here, now. Victoria Hayes stopped just a few feet from him, the delicate rim of her champagne glass tilting slightly in her hand, as if even the stem needed permission to rest, and Daniel forced himself not to look down, not to retreat, though every instinct told him she was about to ask where the IT department kept the spare routers or whether he could fix some glitch she'd heard complaints about. "Daniel, right?" she said, her voice carrying the kind of sharpness that could cut through boardroom chatter, but softened now by something he couldn't name, and the sound of his own name in her mouth startled him more than the chandeliers or the orchestra ever could. She knew who he was. Not just the IT guy, not just a face behind a badge. "Yes, ma'am," he answered quickly, his tone betraying both surprise and caution, and he wished he had found steadier ground in those two words. Her head tilted slightly, assessing him with eyes that seemed to strip away his borrowed suit and secondhand tie until only a single fact remained. He was a man standing alone at the edge of a party, not pretending to be something he wasn't. Her gaze lingered, and then, suddenly, without prelude, she asked, "Why don't you take me home?" For a moment, the words didn't register. Daniel blinked, unsure if he had misheard her beneath the music and laughter. Around them the party continued, waiters weaving between guests, someone's burst of laughter echoing against the marble, a violin sliding into a brighter key, but all of it blurred into background noise, leaving only her sentence suspended between them. "Just the two of us," he managed, his voice low, as if clarifying could anchor him back into sense. Something flickered across her face, amusement, maybe relief, and for the first time all night he saw her laugh, not the polished burst she gave to investors, but a quick, uneven sound that cracked open her composure. "Yes," she said, leaning in slightly. "Just the two of us. No press, no board members, no bodyguards. Just somewhere I don't have to pretend." Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of Emma, asleep at home with the babysitter, and of the stories he'd read about CEOs who devoured smaller companies without blinking. Every warning told him to keep his distance. Yet he remembered the way her smile had faltered earlier, how her shoulders had seemed to sag under invisible weight, and he wondered if she was asking not for escape with him, but for escape from herself. He let the silence stretch, long enough for her eyes to narrow as if bracing for refusal, long enough for him to test the boundaries of risk and responsibility. Then he exhaled. "Okay," he said slowly, choosing his words with care. "But you're coming to my home, not some mansion. It's simple." The corners of her mouth lifted, not in triumph, but in relief, and she nodded once, a gesture both regal and deeply human, as if no one had ever dared offer her simplicity before. And in that nod, Daniel realized he had already stepped across an invisible line, one where power and status blurred and something unspoken began to shift between them. They left the ballroom together, and for Daniel, each step felt louder than the orchestra that faded behind them, his polished shoes clicking against marble while he wondered if anyone was watching, if rumors were already forming like sparks in dry grass. Victoria walked beside him without her usual entourage, no assistants or bodyguards at her shoulder, just the rhythmic sweep of her gown brushing the floor, and that alone made the air thrum with something unreal. Outside, the night pressed cool against his skin, and the city lights stretched out in a jeweled sprawl. A black car idled at the curb, sleek and waiting, but Victoria's eyes flicked toward it only once before turning back to him. She didn't make a move toward the door. Instead, she asked, almost lightly, "Where's your car?" Daniel hesitated, acutely aware of the contrast. Her waiting driver, his dented sedan parked 3 blocks away, its backseat perpetually cluttered with crayons and snack wrappers from Emma. He thought of offering her the car she expected, but then remembered his own words. Not some mansion. It's simple. So he gestured down the street. "This way." They walked in silence, her heels clicking in a rhythm that slowed slightly to match his steps. He tried to picture how absurd this must look, the CEO in couture trailing behind the IT guy in a suit bought off the rack. But when he glanced at her profile, he saw no trace of mockery, only relief, as if each block they put between themselves and the ballroom let her breathe a little deeper. At his car, Daniel rushed to pull open the passenger door, suddenly self-conscious of the faint squeak in the hinge, the worn upholstery, the child's booster seat strapped in back. Yet Victoria slipped in gracefully without hesitation, smoothing her gown and fastening the seatbelt as though sliding into a chauffeured town car. The drive was quiet. Street lamps washed the dashboard in pale light while the city thinned into quieter neighborhoods. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts tangled. Was he reckless for bringing her home? Was he selfish to think of Emma sleeping down the hall? Was he blind to the gulf of status between them? Yet beneath all the worry was a steady pull, a voice reminding him that the loneliness he'd glimpsed in her eyes wasn't a trick. When they reached his building, a modest block with peeling paint around the entryway, he parked and turned to her, half expecting a flash of disdain. Instead, she studied the place with quiet curiosity, then gave him the faintest nod, as though she had been waiting all night for something unadorned and real. Inside, the apartment carried the smell of clean laundry and faint vanilla from Emma's nightlight plug-in. The wallpaper curled at the edges, the couch sagged where years of use had left their mark, but the space was warm in a way Daniel couldn't name. As Victoria stepped in, he saw her shoulders drop, the rigid poise she wore like armor loosening as if she had finally set down a burden no one else had noticed she carried. From the hallway, a small voice stirred the air. "Daddy." Emma peeked out, hair rumpled, eyes heavy with sleep. She rubbed her face with tiny fists before noticing the unfamiliar figure in the doorway. "Who's this?" Daniel cleared his throat, suddenly awkward. "This is my boss," he said softly. Victoria lowered herself onto the worn carpet, her gown pooling around her, until she was eye level with the little girl. "Hi, Emma," she said gently, using her name as though she'd always known it. "Do you like bedtime stories?" Emma's tired frown melted into a spark of excitement, and Daniel felt something inside him shift, an unease, a wonder, as the most powerful woman he'd ever known knelt in his small apartment like a guest in someone else's story. Emma's eyes widened with the kind of surprise that only a child could hold, half wonder, half caution, before she padded forward in her pajamas, her stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. She studied Victoria carefully, as though deciding whether someone in a shimmering gown could belong in a room with peeling wallpaper and a crooked nightlight glow. Victoria waited without rushing her, still kneeling, her dress spilling across the worn carpet like a spill of liquid gold. "I used to love stories before bed," she said softly, her voice gentler than Daniel had ever heard it. "Would you let me read one with you tonight?" Emma's mouth twisted in thought, then brightened. "Okay, but only if you do the voices." She held out the very hungry caterpillar, its spine taped in two places, pages softened from countless turnings. Victoria accepted the book like it was something rare and fragile. She settled cross-legged onto the floor, not caring that the hem of her gown creased beneath her, and began to read. Her voice slipped easily into rhythm, lilting with drama as the caterpillar nibbled through apples and pears, growing hungrier and hungrier. When she raised her pitch for the big stomach ache, Emma giggled so hard she toppled sideways against the couch, and Daniel, leaning in the doorway, felt the sound wash through him like sunlight. He hadn't heard Emma laugh like that in weeks, not since her mother had walked out, leaving nights quieter, stories shorter, and smiles harder to coax. Now the laugh came freely, bubbling from her small frame, while Victoria exaggerated each line, turning pages with a flourish like a seasoned performer. Emma leaned closer, her little fingers brushing the jeweled beads stitched along Victoria's gown, and asked, "Do you read to your kids too?" For a heartbeat, Victoria froze. Her eyes flickered, the question striking somewhere deeper than Emma could have known. "No," she said softly, recovering with a practiced smile. "I never had the chance, but I think I would have liked to." Daniel saw it then, the shadow in her expression, the subtle crack in the mask. He wanted to step in, to ease the moment, but Emma had already pressed her cheek against Victoria's arm as if the answer hadn't changed her trust. The book ended with the caterpillar's transformation into a butterfly, and Emma clapped with delight. Victoria closed it slowly, staring at the bright illustration as though seeing something she had missed all her life. Then she smoothed the girl's hair back and whispered, "Good night, Emma." Within minutes, Emma curled into her blankets, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, eyelids fluttering towards sleep. Victoria remained seated on the floor, book still in her lap, her gaze fixed on the peaceful face of a child who had accepted her without question. Daniel stepped into the room, lowering his voice. "You don't have to stay there. She's out." But Victoria didn't move. "She's lucky," she whispered, almost to herself. "She has you." Her tone carried a fragile ache, one that clung to the air long after she finally set the book aside. Victoria stayed seated on the carpet long after Emma's breathing settled into the soft rhythm of sleep, her hands resting loosely in her lap, her eyes fixed on the small shape beneath the blanket as though she were trying to memorize the picture. The silence in the room was different from the ballroom's silence. Not empty, but full. Full of safety, full of warmth, full of things that couldn't be bought. Daniel lowered himself onto the floor beside her, careful not to make noise. From here, he could see the tension still in her shoulders, the way she carried some invisible weight even when no one was watching. For a moment, he said nothing, letting the quiet stretch until it felt natural, until the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen became the loudest sound in the apartment. "She's lucky," Victoria whispered again, her voice cracking slightly now. "To have you." Her eyes flicked to him, then back to Emma. "My father. He gave me everything money could buy, except himself." The confession slipped out like a thread breaking under strain. "I think I've been chasing that absence ever since." Daniel felt the words land between them, heavy and delicate at once. He had read about her life in headlines, the Ivy League education, the mergers, the ruthless boardroom victories, but never about the hollow spaces left behind. He glanced at her, saw the faint shine in her eyes, and understood that what she gave to the world as strength was, in truth, the armor she had forged to cover a wound no one could see. "What was he like?" Daniel asked quietly, not out of curiosity, but because it felt wrong to let the silence swallow her pain. Victoria hesitated. Her gaze lowered, tracing the pattern of the carpet as though it might anchor her. "Distant. Always working. Always distracted by something larger than me. He said he wanted the best for me, but the best never included being there. Birthdays, recitals, even when I won an award, he sent flowers with a card. That was his way." She drew in a sharp breath, fighting the tremor in her voice. "I learned early on that love was conditional, that approval had to be earned. So I worked harder, climbed higher, built walls higher still. I thought if I became untouchable, I'd stop feeling the emptiness. But tonight, watching your daughter laugh over a storybook, I realized I don't even remember the last time I laughed like that." Daniel listened, the ache in her words resonating against his own memories. Nights when Emma asked why her mother wasn't coming home, when he scrambled to be both comfort and stability at once. He reached for words carefully, not wanting to offer cliches. "You don't have to chase anymore," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "Sometimes home isn't about wealth or achievement or proving anything. It's about being there. Just being there when it matters." Victoria turned her head toward him, her eyes shimmering under the dim light. For once, she didn't look like a CEO. She looked like someone standing at the edge of exhaustion, afraid of what might happen if she stopped running. For a long while, neither of them moved. They simply sat on the worn carpet beside a child's bed, sharing a silence that carried more truth than any words either had spoken all night. The apartment was hushed, the kind of hush that didn't ask to be broken. Emma's soft breathing filled the small bedroom like a lullaby, and for once Victoria didn't rush to fill the silence with words, plans, or decisions. She simply sat with it, letting the weight of Daniel's presence beside her be enough. Daniel leaned back slightly, his shoulder brushing the wall, his eyes on Emma, but his thoughts on the woman next to him. He had seen Victoria Hayes command rooms with a glance, silence executives twice her age, and slice through negotiations like a blade. But now, her gaze lingered on a child's nightlight, her expression stripped of strategy, as though she wasn't entirely sure how to exist without armor. "You're different than I imagined," Daniel said quietly, not turning his head. Her lips twitched into a faint smile, tired but real. "And how did you imagine me?" He hesitated, searching for honesty that wouldn't wound. "Untouchable, like everyone else does. Ice, gold, ruthless, all those names they throw around when they talk about you." Victoria gave a small, almost bitter laugh. "The Iron Lady in heels. I've heard it." She tilted her head, eyes following the slow flicker of the night light against the wall. "They think strength means never bending, never breaking. But it's not strength. It's just survival." Daniel let the words sink in. He thought of his own survival, the hurried breakfasts before school drop-offs, the bills stacked on the counter, the long evenings when loneliness pressed in after Emma was asleep. His battles weren't fought in boardrooms, but they were battles all the same. "Survival's exhausting," he murmured. "Yes," she whispered, almost inaudible. Then, after a pause, "I don't even know what it feels like to stop." Daniel turned then, just enough to meet her eyes. They glistened in the dim light, not with the gleam of authority, but with the fragile honesty of someone afraid to be seen. Maybe stopping doesn't mean weakness, he said. Maybe it just means letting someone in. Her breath caught, and for a moment she looked away, blinking rapidly as though fighting back something unfamiliar. When she looked back at him, her voice was unsteady. And if I don't know how? Daniel's chest tightened, but he kept his tone steady, quiet. Then you learn. One small step at a time. They didn't reach for each other. They didn't need to. The space between them was filled with something more than touch, an understanding born from loneliness recognized, from burdens silently compared, from the fragile truth that both of them had been carrying too much for too long. And so they sat, side by side on the worn carpet of a child's room, not CEO and employee, not iron and ordinary, but simply two people breathing in the same rhythm, letting the silence speak for them both. The first rays of dawn crept through the blinds, painting thin lines of gold across the small kitchen. Daniel stood at the stove in his t-shirt, pouring batter onto a frying pan that hissed in protest. The smell of butter and coffee mingled with the faint sweetness of Emma's strawberry shampoo, still lingering in the air from the night before. Behind him, soft footsteps padded against the linoleum. He turned to see Victoria, barefoot now, her heels abandoned near the couch, her gown carefully folded across the armrest. In the early light, stripped of armor, she seemed almost unrecognizable. Not the formidable CO the city revered, but a woman with hair slightly tousled and eyes still heavy with the weight of sleepless honesty. "Morning," Daniel said, offering a small smile. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed loosely, the tension in her posture eased as though she had set something down. "I don't think I've seen a sunrise like this in years," she admitted, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "Usually I'm still at my desk when the sun comes up." "Then this one's on the house," Daniel replied, turning back to the pan. The first pancake flipped awkwardly, half folding on itself, and he muttered under his breath. Victoria stepped forward, reaching for the spatula. "Let me try." "You cook?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. She smirked faintly. "Not well, but I do like to pretend." She slid the spatula beneath the second pancake, concentrating as if it were a delicate contract. With a quick motion, she flipped it straight onto the edge of the pan, where it folded into a wrinkled mess. For a moment there was silence. Then Victoria laughed, loud, unguarded, with tears pricking her eyes. Not the rehearsed laugh she gave in boardrooms, but a laugh that shook her shoulders until she pressed a hand against the counter for balance. Daniel found himself laughing too, the kind of laughter that carried relief more than humor, as though both of them had been waiting for a reason to release it. Emma wandered in, rubbing her eyes, her rabbit still dangling from one arm. "What's so funny?" she mumbled. "Your dad and I are terrible chefs," Victoria said between giggles, holding up the ruined pancake like proof. Emma squinted at the misshapen lump, then shrugged. "I'll still eat it," she declared, climbing onto a chair at the table. Daniel set a plate in front of her, the second attempt a little rounder, a little more edible. Victoria poured juice into a plastic cup with cartoon flowers, smiling faintly at how natural the motion felt. They sat together at the small table, the three of them, steam rising from a stack of pancakes that looked nothing like the ones on magazine covers. Yet the room felt warmer than any gala Daniel had ever attended, richer than any spread Victoria had likely ordered at a private club. For the first time in years, Victoria let herself sit without checking a watch, without rehearsing her next move. She chewed slowly, smiling at Emma's chatter about school projects and favorite cartoons, listening with the kind of attention Daniel realized no one at her company ever received. It was laughter that healed, Daniel thought as he watched her, laughter that made the room brighter than the sunlight itself. And in that simple kitchen, with syrup dripping onto the table and a 6-year-old interrupting every other sentence, something unspoken shifted again, something fragile, but undeniably real. After breakfast, the plates sat rinsed in the sink, a faint sweetness of syrup still clinging to the air. Emma had retreated to her room to change into fresh pajamas, humming tunelessly, while Daniel leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching Victoria linger in the kitchen as though she wasn't quite ready to leave. Her heels stood by the door like a reminder of the world waiting outside, glossy and sharp against the scuffed linoleum. She stared at them for a long moment before finally slipping them on, her posture straightening with the faint click of each buckle. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, the armor sliding back into place. Emma came skipping in, her rabbit tucked under one arm. She stopped in front of Victoria, tilting her head. "Do you have to go?" Victoria crouched down, her gown exchanged for Daniel's oversized cardigan she had borrowed for comfort. Kneeling to Emma's level, she smoothed a hand over the little girl's hair. "Yes, sweetheart. But thank you for letting me be here." Her voice wavered on the words, almost breaking. "You reminded me what really matters." Emma didn't quite understand, but she hugged her anyway, wrapping small arms tightly around Victoria's neck. For a moment, Victoria closed her eyes, holding on as though she might never let go, her breath catching against the child's shoulder. When she finally rose, her gaze drifted to Daniel. The weight of what she wanted to say lingered in her eyes before her lips found the words. "I asked you to take me home," she said softly. "At the party, I thought I meant escape. But last night," her voice faltered, steadied again. "I think I actually found it." Daniel's throat tightened. He wasn't a man prone to speeches, but in that instant, honesty felt simple. He gave her a small, steady smile. "You're welcome back anytime," he said. Then, after a pause, his eyes flicked toward Emma. "Just the two of us, or three?" Something flickered in Victoria's expression, part gratitude, part ache, as if she wanted to believe she could hold on to this moment forever. She nodded once, slowly, then reached for her coat. The door closed behind her with a quiet click, and the apartment seemed to exhale, settling back into its ordinary hum. But for Daniel, and for Emma still clutching her rabbit at the window, the morning no longer felt ordinary at all. Monday arrived, and with it the steady rhythm of the office. Phones ringing, keyboards clattering, the low murmur of conversations stitched with urgency. Yet something was different. Whispers trailed in Victoria Hayes's wake as she walked through the glass corridors, her heels striking the polished floor in their familiar cadence. People speculated where she had disappeared to after the company party, why her car had left without her, why her security detail had been dismissed so abruptly. Victoria gave no explanations. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the need. She paused in the lobby, watching an employee juggle a diaper bag and a laptop as he hurried toward the elevators, his face flushed with the stress of lateness. Normally, she would have frowned, demanded punctuality above excuses. But now her gaze softened. She stepped forward, pressed the elevator button for him, and said quietly, "Take a breath. Your work will wait. Your child won't." The man blinked at her, startled, then nodded with visible relief. By the time the doors closed, the story had already begun to ripple outward. Over the weeks that followed, subtle shifts appeared. Emails went out announcing family days at the company, afternoons where employees could bring their children, where the cafeteria served pancakes instead of catered hors d'oeuvres. Policies for single parents were rewritten, offering flexible hours and childcare stipends. Meetings ended earlier, not later. For once, the office lights dimmed before the sun did. And though no one dared to say it aloud, they noticed another change. The CEO herself no longer lingered past midnight at her desk. She left earlier, sometimes carrying no briefcase at all, as if she had somewhere else worth rushing toward. For Daniel, the difference was quieter, more private. Passing her in the hallway, he would catch her gaze, just for a moment. There was no smile, no nod, no public acknowledgement. Only a quiet understanding that what had happened in his apartment was not a weakness to be hidden, but a truth to be carried forward. Victoria still held power. She still commanded rooms, still negotiated with precision, still bore the title that demanded iron. But beneath it, she allowed herself something new. The possibility of softness, of choosing connection without fear it would undo her. She had found something that no corner office, no quarterly report, no accolade could give her. Not wealth, not status, not victory. Something far simpler, far rarer. The city skyline glittered through the office windows as evening settled in, but for once, Victoria Hayes wasn't there to see it. She had already left, stepping out into the fading light with no briefcase in hand, no phone pressed to her ear, no entourage trailing behind. For the first time in years, her day had ended before the sun disappeared. At Daniel's apartment, the night unfolded differently. Emma sat cross-legged on the living room rug, Crayons spread across the coffee table, humming as she filled a page with bright loops of color. Daniel leaned against the doorframe, watching her, while in his mind he replayed the moment Victoria had crouched on this very carpet, reading a storybook with more heart than polish, her laughter breaking into the room like sunlight after rain. That memory lingered, not as fantasy, but as proof. Proof that even someone wrapped in glass and steel could still long for something simple, something real. In the weeks since that night, Victoria had begun to change, not with grand gestures or public announcements, but with quiet decisions that rippled outward, shorter meetings, policies written with families in mind, a leadership style that allowed for humanity instead of erasing it. She hadn't spoken to Daniel about it, not directly, but he felt the echoes every time an employee carried a child into the office without fear, every time the cafeteria served pancakes on Fridays, and the sound of children's laughter filled a building once hushed by formality. For Victoria, power had never been the problem. It was loneliness that had carved her hollow. But in the worn walls of Daniel's apartment, in the easy chatter of a 6-year-old with syrup on her chin, she had found what wealth could never purchase. Not escape, not performance, not control. Home, not the kind with marble floors or sweeping staircases, but the kind where laughter spilled over mistakes in the kitchen, where silence meant peace instead of absence, where love was measured not in gifts but in presence. And as Daniel tucked Emma into bed that night, smoothing the blanket over her small shoulders, he realized the gift Victoria had left them wasn't temporary. She had shown him something too, that sometimes the strongest walls came down with the smallest gestures, and that even the most unreachable hearts could be reached by kindness, by patience, by being there. Because in the end, titles fade, fortunes shift, and chandeliers dim. But connection, real, fragile, human connection, remains. Sometimes home isn't where you live. It's where you're loved.